an actual cash sale. And so we take our sales, and we divide it by our accounts receivable. And you can see here, sales were 5,000, accounts receivable coming off the balance sheet was 956. We get 5.23 times. It means that we're basically taking our accounts receivable and we are collecting them in whole, turning them to cash, a little over 5 times per year. All right. Again, I find it so much more intuitive to look at day sales in receivables instead. I like to think of this as an average age of receivables. All we're going to do is take 365, divide it by our receivables turnover. So that's 365 divided by what we just calculated was 5.23. You get 70 days. All right, so we can turn over our receivables accounts on average 70 days, which if we are extending credit for 1 month, this is horrible. Yeah, that means people are paying on average over a month late. Yeah. If instead, if we were extending credit for 2 months, this still isn't great. We still have some people paying late. That makes sense? On average, 10 days late or so. If we have a policy that we're extending credit for 3 months, they're paying off early. That makes sense to everyone?
Yes.
And whether that's good or not depends upon how we set up the loan. Like I just worked on a bunch of what they call factor loans for a construction company. And the way that the lender had set up this contractor's notes were he paid all the interest first and then he paid the principal back later. Not like your normal car loans where are part principal, part interest. He had no incentive to pay back early.
Yeah.
When you pay your car loan back early, and it's set up where you pay less interest. And so I might not be so excited to accept those early payments if you're getting out of the interest, especially if interest rates are falling.
Yeah. It's like penalizing for paying off early.
Yes.
Pay what you contracted out.
Yes,
Prepayment.
right. There's prepayment penalties on mortgages. Yeah, prepayment penalties. Or they'll front load all the interest. And that's what this poor contractor, he was ending up paying over 200% interest if you annualized it. He had no idea.
Yeah.
And so they were hiring me to figure out, what his costs were and his losses and this whole deal that he got mixed up in. And he thought he was paying 20-some%. I'm gonna give you guys the contract. You're not gonna see any names on it or anything like that. I'm gonna have you calculate the return later in the class and see what you get, because I did this over and over again, and I kept on saying, okay, the decimal point goes over how many places? 2 points? And I kept seeing I saw, it was like 20, it was 2.17. And I kept thinking, he kept telling me that he was paying 20-some%. 217, dude. He totally had no idea. Annualized, yeah. Yeah. So we're gonna do that in class so that none of you get into that sort of mess. Something that you should definitely be aware of, whether you're buying a car or whether you're getting a high-risk factor payment, which is basically just a factor loan is where you actually are using your accounts receivable to put up as collateral for a loan. And so no matter what, you need to know how to calculate a return, and that's where you'll learn that here, right? All right, any questions about this guy here? How do you feel about this company's ability Now, after we've seen all these ratios, how do you feel about this company's ability to meet their obligations of debt? Total, here. You don't really feel that great about it. Can you articulate why? What's that? So they had, long-term debt, that was about 25% of their total long-term financing. So they had quite a bit of short-term debt, we could actually figure out what percent, if we went back to the balance sheet, that was short-term. So a lot of this obligation is going to be coming in the next year.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing is that their EBIT looks great.
Yeah.
Right, so their earnings look like they should be easily meeting their obligations. However, when you dig deeper, those sales, I'm keeping you thinking about these sales, where are they coming from? These sales, some of them are receivables, right? And these receivables are coming in on average every 70 days.
If they come in at all.
Yeah. And this will be capturing if they come in at all. Maybe this company actually did have maybe a 60-day policy, and they got, but on average, their extension of credit, these people are paying on average 10 days late, on average.
Yeah.
That's quite a bit, so they're paying late if it's 60 days. We can't really go past this, for this class, but I have some reservations, about whether they're able to meet their obligations short term. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
And it has to do with timing. I feel like based on all these ratios, they would be able to meet their obligations, but I'm not sure if they're able to meet them on time. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
And it's about, I'd have to look at the debt contracts. In other words, when is that debt due? If you told me this short-term debt was due in a year, I feel like, okay, they'll make it.
Yeah.
If it's due in 2 months, I'm a little bit less confident. Does that make sense to everybody? If it's due tomorrow, I'm really less confident.
So you look at all the ratios, too, like,
Yeah.
going back to the cash ratio, we have
Mhm.
like 35 cents per dollar in
Yeah.
assets that, like,
So
if
they
you have bills due tomorrow, you got 35.
I feel confident that they can hit 35% of their debt obligations today, but what about the other 2/3 of it? It really depends upon those inventories and those receivables, doesn't it?
Yeah.
All right, make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
All right. Hope you analyze your firm of choice out there a little bit better. All right, so now we're gonna do a whole different set of ratios, and these are called asset turnover ratios. And the most important one we're gonna deal with is this very first one. It's the total asset turnover. Think of these sets of ratios as the firm's efficiency of assets. And what are assets designed to do? They make these decisions to invest in assets from cash down all the way to fixed assets, right? On their balance sheet. They're making these decisions. And what does this investment, what do they intend to do with this investment in assets? Make money, earn income. Does that make sense? Produce sales. That's the whole thing, is these assets are the income generation. That's what it's the engine of the firm. If they choose to hold all their assets as cash, they're probably not, they're gonna be really liquid, but they're not gonna make much money. If on the other hand, they decide to hold no current assets and invest everything in those high return fixed assets, then all of a sudden, they might be able to produce and generate a lot of income, a lot of EBIT, a lot of cash flow, but they're not gonna be liquid, so they better hope they got cash flow coming off those assets. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
So there's this big, spectrum of what could happen here. But this is all about the generation of income here. Generation of sales is the first one. Total asset turnover is just you take your sales divided by your total assets. Sales comes off of top line of the income statement, total assets come off of your balance sheet. We plug in sales of 5,000, total assets of 5394, we get 0.93. That means for every $1, I'll put this over here, total asset turnover in sales over total assets, and if we get 0.93, that means for every $1 of assets we have on our balance sheet, and I can't tell if they're fixed or if they're current, we're producing 93 cents worth of sales, right?
Right.
There is no number that is too high. We want the higher the better. Does that make sense to everyone? I do want to throw this out there though. Let me give you a scenario where we've got two firms. They are across the street from one another and they are identical in every single way. With one exception, and that is one firm was just sold to a new owner. So they're identical in every way. They were built in the same year. They are physically the same. It's just that one of them just got a new owner. Was just placed on a new balance sheet. They're producing the same amount of sales out of both plants, identical sales. Are both of them gonna show up the same in this ratio?
No,
No, and why?
because he doesn't have the same amount of assets.
They're not gonna show up as the same amount of assets on the balance sheet. The firm that just sold is gonna sell for a market value today, which is presumably higher than it did 20 years ago, let's say, that this factory was built, where the other factory was actually placed on the balance sheet. So let's say it sold for $2 million today, but the place was built years ago for $500,000. So the old firm, the one that has been on the same old balance sheet for 20 years, has $500,000 in fixed assets then that have depreciated over 20 years, which is likely to be depreciated away by this point, and be virtually worthless on the balance sheet. Does that make sense? Whereas this identical firm that just got sold to our new owner, he puts this on his balance sheet at $2 million and he hasn't gotten a chance to depreciate anything yet. So the new firm looks like they have $2 million worth of assets, the old firm has nothing. Which one looks more efficient at producing revenues? The old firm. The old firm's gonna look like they're producing gold out of nothing. Does that make sense? Lots and lots of sales, but virtually no assets. Does that make sense to everybody? So the age of these firms matter a whole lot. So don't be fooled by these ratios. Don't just mindlessly calculate the ratio and then cross-sectionally compare two companies. And then don't be judgmental of saying one is far more efficient than the other. Dive deeper. Does that make sense to everyone? And age matters a lot. Those that are older firms will look more efficient naturally. Make sense to everyone? Okay, so that's one thing to consider. I want you in general to consider every ratio that has something coming off the balance sheet. I want you to consider and really scrutinize it. Does anybody know why I don't trust that balance sheet? Depreciation. The idea of book value, which is the assets value minus the depreciation. Everything you're looking at from the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, you can get all the information off the Bloomberg lab. Everything that you look at there has nothing to do with market values. It has everything, their financials have everything to do with their balance sheets, which are book values. Does that make sense to everybody? So everything that has a ratio that's got some element of that balance sheet in it, you gotta think about it and scrutinize it, and don't make judgment too quickly about it. Does that make sense to everybody? So that's real important to remember that that balance sheet are book values and not market values, right? All right, next up is a net working capital turnover. All we're doing is sales again, just like with the total asset turnover, but instead of using just total assets, we're looking at the net current assets, net working capital. So sales over net working capital, sales comes off the income statement, net working capital, we have to peel off of the balance sheet. So sales was 5,000, we divide that by our working capital, current assets were 2256. We're gonna subtract from that our current liabilities at 1995. We get 19.16 is our number. I like to do this always, 19.16 times for every $1 of net working capital, which I like to think of as our net current assets. Does that make sense to everyone? It's our current assets less all of our current liabilities. So I like to, that's the way my little brain thinks. All right, so instead of talking about it as net working capital, I like to think net current assets. So those current assets that are left over after they've paid all of their obligations that are current within this next year. So for every $1 of net working capital, we have a little over 19 sales. What is this ratio going to depend upon? This is really getting at this choice of investment into short-term versus long-term assets. Remember, the short-term assets don't produce much return.
Yeah.
The long-term produces all the return. Does that make sense to everybody? The higher that number is, would indicate to me something about that investment into fixed assets. Because it's really not the net working capital that's producing, right? It's really the fixed assets that are producing. And so here we say, for every $1 of net working capital we have, it's producing $19.16 in return in sales. Yep.
Where does fixed assets come into play when it's just current assets minus current liabilities?
They're not up there, are they? I'm saying that number's kind of big, 19.16.
Yeah.
Right? Does that make sense? And it's not the current assets that produces those sales, it's the fixed. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the higher this number is, the more likely you've got more invested in those long-term assets. And it's just, here we're just like attributing it. For every $1 of net working capital, there's 19.16 worth of sales. The higher that number is, you're not gonna produce those sales with cash. Correct? Yeah. net current too, the net current.
So sales.
So let's say that our current assets were all in cash. They were all in cash, and we paid off all of our current liabilities, giving us net working capital of $19.95. No, yeah, it's actually less than that. You guys can subtract off those two, get a number. It's something around 250, 255, something like that. 255 net current assets there, net working capital. Is that cash? If that's all held in cash, is that what's producing this
No.
$19 worth of sales? No. It's gotta be coming from the fixed. The higher this number is, the more likely you got a lot of investment in those fixed assets. Does that make sense? Cause they're the ones that are really the producers. Does that make sense? Does that help you?
Slightly.
Slightly.
Yeah.
It's about what's not in the ratio here. Let's see if I don't know if I can explain it any differently.
So sales basically come from current and non-current assets.
Sales come from our asset side of the balance sheet.
And you're taking into account current, so.
Yeah, we're looking at the net current, so we've taken out the current liabilities here. Does that make sense? So those current assets have already paid off, we've already paid off all of our current liabilities in that denominator. Alright, so what's left over is our net current assets. And the higher this ratio is, there's no way that our firm could be producing a ton of sales by sitting on a bunch of cash.
Yeah.
The lower this number is, the more likely there's been this disproportionate, investment in the denominator in current assets, so which would pull down this ratio. So as this ratio gets lower, probably being driven by the fact that the denominator's getting larger, get more net working capital. Does that make sense?
So more cash.
More cash.
Okay.
Yeah, more cash you have, the less,
Money you make.
yeah. That makes sense to everyone? A little bit of intuition? Alright, our last one is our fixed asset turnover. So we move from our liquid portion of our balance sheet to our less liquid. This is just sales over net fixed assets. Notice how these two ratios, they're after kind of similar things. Here in the net working capital turnover, we're taking sales and dividing it by our net current assets. Here, we're taking our sales and dividing it by our net fixed assets. All right, so when this guy, as I said, as your net working capital turnover goes up, what do you think will happen to your turnover on your fixed assets? Let's talk about this first. Sales over net fixed assets. What are we getting at here? We plug in the numbers, 5,000 for sales, $3,138 in net fixed assets. We get a number 1.59 times. What does that 1.59 times mean?
You have 1.59 sales, dollars of assets. Yes, and the money we're getting.
So every $1 of net fixed assets we're holding on our balance sheet, it's producing $1.59 in sales.
Okay, yeah.
Does that make sense to everyone? As opposed to when we're looking up here at our total assets as the denominator, total assets are producing 93 cents. Okay? And then our working capital as the basis, producing 19.16. It would make you think, hey, these current assets invest in more of them, right?
Okay, yeah.
We should just invest in a whole lot more current assets and then we'd be golden, right? Is that what it's telling us?
Yeah.
No, not at all. It's quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. And so you're producing the same amount of sales, 5,000, right? On average, across all your assets, you got 93 cents being produced off of all of them, all right? Your fixed assets, 1.59 per fixed asset. Your current assets, which don't produce much in reality, 19.16. The higher this guy goes,
The more net fixed assets.
the more net fixed assets you probably got. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
And so all this is doing is trying to get a gauge on how efficient your asset allocations are. So, does anybody see a tie between liquidity and these asset turnover ratios? Do you see a tie between them? If you saw a firm that had really low asset turnover, really low asset turnover, would you maybe go and look for problems with liquidity? Or do you think you would have a problem with liquidity? It's possible that you're too liquid. Does that make sense? So if you have a really low efficiency on your asset turnover, one of the first places I look is to see that allocation between current versus fixed assets, right? They might be a firm that's just holding a lot of current assets, causing their total asset turnover to look bad. The lower the number, possibly. Right, that could be one reason for it. Another reason for it could be the age of the firm. It could be a really new firm. All right, does that make sense to everybody? Just trying to train you to look deeper. Train you to read between the lines here. Right? Working with the bank right now. Don't understand the accounting exactly. In the accounting here, we have a bank, Gulf Coast, that we're working with, and they have a very interesting model. They are very good at assessing risk, is my impression. Very good. They are holding a lot of very risky assets. They buy troubled assets.
So they get them cheap.
They get them at a big discount. Big discount. And do you know, this is what I did not know until just this week. How does that go on the balance sheet? No, on the they're going to go on the balance sheet at a market price, not what they purchased